Firstly, because my father's family came from this part of Scotland. Secondly, because my husband and I are lucky enough to spend...
At exactly 7:18 in the morning on December 3rd, a single envelope delivered to Ray Mill House triggered a collapse so profound that even palace staff who had witnessed decades of royal crisis stood frozen in shock. Queen Camilla, alone in her study, opened DNA test results that shattered assumptions held for nearly 50 years. Within minutes, her anguished sobs echoed through corridors as the carefully constructed narrative of her family's lineage crumbled into dust. What the results revealed wasn't just unexpected, it was devastating, confirming suspicions that had whispered for generations. Stay with us to explore the details. The morning everything changed. The news broke not through official channels or carefully worded palace statements, but through a frantic phone call at 7:18 in the morning on December 3rd. A senior aide, voice shaking with an emotion that decades of royal service had trained him to suppress, contacted Buckingham Palace with 3 words that sent waves through the entire institution. "She's broken down." Within minutes, the palace entered a state of emergency lockdown that had nothing to do with security threats or public scandal, and everything to do with protecting a secret that had just been confirmed in the most clinical, undeniable way possible. At Ray Mill House, where Queen Camilla had retreated, staff reported hearing sounds they had never associated with the composed, resilient woman they had served for years. Sobbing that seemed to come from somewhere deep and primal. The kind of crying that happens when a person's entire understanding of themselves suddenly collapses. One housekeeper, who had worked for Camilla for nearly 2 decades, later told a confidant that she had never heard such anguish, not during the darkest days of public condemnation, not during the years of being cast as the villain in Charles and Diana's marriage, not even during the recent humiliations. The source of this breakdown lay in a thick cream envelope that had been delivered just after 7 that morning by a trusted aide who had flown overnight from Zurich. Inside was a document bearing the letterhead of one of Europe's most prestigious private genetic laboratories, a facility known for handling sensitive cases involving aristocratic families, inheritance disputes, and questions of lineage that could never be asked publicly but demanded private answers. The document was brief, clinical, and absolutely devastating in its clarity. Queen Camilla had opened the envelope alone in her study, a decision she would later describe to Charles as both the bravest and most foolish thing she had ever done. The results inside confirmed what anonymous letters had suggested for months, what medical necessities had forced into the open, what whispered speculation had danced around for nearly half a century. The DNA analysis, conducted with samples from multiple family members and verified through independent testing, revealed truths about her children's paternity that overturned decades of accepted narrative. Her first call went to King Charles, who was in Scotland reviewing estate matters at Balmoral. Those who overheard the king's side of the conversation reported that he went completely silent after the initial greeting, listening for what seemed like an eternity before finally saying in a voice stripped of all emotion, "I'm coming now." He canceled every engagement, ordered his helicopter prepared immediately, and within 90 minutes was airborne, racing south toward a confrontation he had desperately hoped would never arrive. The second call went to her children, Tom Parker Bowles and Laura Lopes. According to sources close to the family, both conversations were brief, anguished, and filled with the kind of apologies that can never adequately address the magnitude of what had been hidden. Tom reportedly asked only one question: "Does father know?" The answer, complicated and painful, was that Andrew Parker Bowles had always known, had agreed to the arrangement decades ago, and had maintained the fiction with the kind of aristocratic discretion that values social stability over emotional honesty. Inside Buckingham Palace, senior staff moved with urgent efficiency once the initial shock subsided. The information was immediately classified at the highest level of confidentiality. only a handful of people, fewer than 10 in the entire royal household, were briefed on the actual content of the DNA results. The rest were simply told that Queen Camilla had experienced a personal medical emergency and that all inquiries should be directed to a single designated communications officer who had been instructed to say absolutely nothing of substance. Prince William was briefed personally by his private secretary at 8:30 that morning. His reaction, described by those present as controlled but intense, revealed the complicated position he now occupied. This was vindication of sorts, proof that the concerns about Camilla's judgment and her relationship with truth had foundation beyond mere protocol violations. But it was also a crisis that threatened to destabilize his father at precisely the moment when the monarchy needed strength and clarity. William's first question was reportedly practical and strategic. Who else knows, and how do we contain this? Princess Anne, briefed shortly after William, responded with characteristic directness. The truth was always going to surface eventually, she said. Secrets of this magnitude don't stay buried in an age of genetic testing and public curiosity. Her concern wasn't moral judgment, but institutional stability. If the results became public, the questions would extend far beyond Camilla's personal life into territory that touched the monarchy's credibility on matters of lineage, a subject that, however outdated it might seem, still carried weight in constitutional and public perception. By mid-morning, as news of Camilla's breakdown spread through the tight network of senior palace staff, one question dominated every whispered conversation in every corridor of every royal residence. What exactly had the DNA results revealed, and how had a routine medical screening evolved into a crisis that left a queen consort sobbing alone in her study, while the king raced south in a helicopter, and the entire institution braced for a truth it had spent half a century avoiding? Let's dive into it. The subtle signs. To understand how the monarchy arrived on this devastating December morning, we must step back through the months of mounting pressure that made DNA testing unavoidable. The story begins not with scandal or accusation, but with something far more mundane and far more impossible to ignore. A medical emergency that required genetic information no one in the family wanted to provide. It started in late August when Tom Parker Bowles, Camilla's son, experienced a health scare that sent him to a private London hospital for comprehensive screening. The doctors, reviewing his family medical history, identified patterns that suggested potential hereditary conditions requiring genetic testing to assess properly. Routine procedure in modern medicine, but for a family with secrets embedded in its very foundation, nothing about genetics could ever be routine. Tom provided samples, underwent testing, and the results came back with markers that didn't align with the Parker Bowles family medical history on file. The attending physician, bound by medical ethics but aware of the sensitive nature of treating anyone connected to the royal family, approached the situation with careful discretion. He suggested, in the gentlest possible terms, that Tom might want to verify his paternal lineage for the sake of accurate medical records. It was phrased as practical advice, nothing more. But Tom understood immediately what was being suggested, and the ground beneath his understanding of himself shifted in ways that no amount of aristocratic composure could fully conceal. Tom confronted his mother in early September during what was supposed to be a quiet family lunch at Ray Mill House. According to those who knew about the conversation afterward, Camilla initially deflected, suggesting that medical records from decades past were often incomplete or unreliable. But Tom pressed gently but firmly, and eventually she admitted that there were complexities in her past that she had hoped would never require explanation. She didn't confirm the specifics that day, but her inability to deny the implications told Tom everything he needed to know. Meanwhile, whispers had been growing louder in circles that intersected with both the royal family and the old aristocracy. Anonymous letters began arriving at Buckingham Palace in late September, letters that didn't make threats or demands but simply posed questions. questions about Laura Lopes's striking resemblance to certain members of the aristocracy who were not Andrew Parker Bowles. Questions about why Tom's features aligned so poorly with the Parker Bowles family photographs that lined the walls of their ancestral home. Questions about the timing of Camilla's early relationship with Charles and the births of her children. The letters were never traced to a single source, but palace security noted that they arrived with knowledge that suggested someone from within aristocratic circles, someone who had been present during the relevant years, and who perhaps felt that truth mattered more than the social stability that silence preserved. Whether motivated by conscience, revenge, or simply the chaotic impulse to expose what everyone suspected but no one acknowledged, the letters achieved their purpose. They made the questions impossible to ignore. By October, the situation had reached Prince William's attention through intelligence briefings that monitored potential threats to the monarchy's reputation. William saw immediately how genetic questions about her children could explode into a crisis that touched not just her credibility, but the institution's relationship with truth itself. If the monarchy had knowingly accepted and celebrated a fabricated family narrative for decades, what else might the public assume had been similarly constructed? Princess Anne, briefed separately, responded with her characteristic pragmatism. If there are questions about lineage, answer them definitively, she advised Charles during a tense meeting at Balmoral in late October. Uncertainty is more dangerous than difficult truth. The institution has survived scandal before. It cannot survive the appearance of ongoing deception. Her words carried weight precisely because Anne had spent 7 decades watching the monarchy navigate crises, and she understood that the rules had changed in an era where genetic testing was accessible, affordable, and increasingly routine. King Charles found himself in an impossible position. The woman he had loved for decades, the woman he had finally been able to marry and crown as his queen consort, was facing questions that threatened to unravel not just her own narrative, but the legitimacy of the family structure they had presented to the world. Yet he also understood Anne's point. If the questions persisted and the palace remained silent, the speculation would only grow more damaging. Better to know the truth privately and control how it might eventually surface than to wait for some future crisis to force revelation at the worst possible moment. The pressure intensified in November, when Laura Lopes, Camilla's daughter, received her own medical consultation that raised similar questions about genetic history. The doctors were more direct this time, having learned of Tom's situation through the interconnected world of private medical practices serving aristocratic families. Laura, confronted with the same implications her brother had faced, went directly to her mother and demanded the complete truth. No deflection, no gentle evasions, just the facts about who her biological father actually was. Camilla, cornered by medical necessity, family pressure, and the mounting weight of secrets she had carried for nearly 50 years, finally agreed to comprehensive DNA testing in mid-November. The decision wasn't made lightly or quickly. It came after consultations with Charles, painful conversations with Andrew Parker Bowles, who had maintained the fiction for decades out of aristocratic loyalty and genuine affection for the children he had raised as his own, and legal advisors who explained exactly what the results might mean for everyone involved. The testing was arranged through the most discreet channels available. A private Swiss laboratory, one that had handled sensitive genetic questions for European royal and aristocratic families for 3 generations, agreed to conduct the analysis with absolute confidentiality. Samples were collected from Camilla, from Tom, from Laura, and from Andrew Parker Bowles, who participated with the weary resignation of a man who had always known this day would eventually arrive. Additional samples were secured from other relevant parties through methods that were never fully explained, but which involved the kind of access only the royal family's security apparatus could arrange. The samples were couriered to Zurich in late November. The laboratory confirmed receipt, and estimated results would be available in 3 weeks, putting the timeline right at the beginning of December. Those 3 weeks were among the longest of Camilla's life, a period of waiting that she later described as suspended between 2 versions of reality. one where the family narrative she had presented for decades might somehow be confirmed despite all evidence to the contrary, and another where everything she had built, every relationship she had shaped, every public appearance she had navigated would be revealed as constructed on a foundation of deliberate deception. As November turned to December and the results grew imminent, Camilla retreated further into Ray Mill House, declining most social engagements and speaking to only her closest confidants. Charles visited when he could, but the tension between them had grown heavy with the weight of approaching truth. They both knew that whatever the envelope from Zurich contained, their relationship would be fundamentally altered by it. Some truths, once confirmed with scientific certainty, can never be walked back or softened by context. The secret testing process. The decision to conduct DNA testing through a Swiss laboratory wasn't arbitrary or simply a matter of geographic convenience. It was strategic, calculated, and rooted in generations of European aristocratic tradition that understood some questions required answers but could never be asked publicly. The facility chosen, located in a discreet building outside Zurich, had served royal families across Europe for decades, handling paternity disputes, inheritance claims, and lineage verification with the kind of absolute confidentiality that only extreme wealth and power could command. The sample collection happened over 3 carefully coordinated days in late November. Camilla provided her sample first, at Ray Mill House, with a private physician she had trusted for years conducting the simple cheek swab in complete privacy. Tom Parker Bowles and Laura Lopes gave their samples separately, each meeting with the same physician at neutral locations away from anywhere that might attract attention or speculation. The process was clinical, quick, and profoundly uncomfortable for everyone involved, not because of the physical procedure but because of what it represented. Decades of accepted family narrative reduced to genetic markers that would either confirm or destroy the story they had all lived. Andrew Parker Bowles participated with dignified resignation. He had always known the truth, had agreed to raise the children as his own in an arrangement that reflected aristocratic values of duty over emotion, and had maintained that fiction with the kind of loyalty that characterized his entire approach to life. His sample was collected at his London residence, and those present reported that he showed no emotion beyond a slight tightening around his eyes when the physician sealed the sample container. The most complicated collection involved samples from the suspected biological fathers, men whose identities were known within certain aristocratic circles, but had never been publicly confirmed or even seriously investigated. Palace security, operating with resources and access that bypassed normal legal constraints, secured these samples through methods that were carefully documented for internal records, but would never see public disclosure. The legality existed in gray areas that powerful institutions navigate when the stakes justify the means. William and Anne had insisted on independent verification, refusing to allow the process to be handled entirely through channels Camilla or Charles might control. A second laboratory, this one in Germany, received duplicate samples through a separate chain of custody. The results would be compared to ensure accuracy and prevent any possibility of manipulation or error that might later be used to question the findings. This dual verification added complexity and cost, but it also guaranteed that whatever the results showed, they would be scientifically unassailable. King Charles occupied a painful middle ground throughout the process. He wanted to support Camilla, wanted to believe that somehow the whispers and suspicions had been wrong all along, but he also understood that the institution required clarity, and clarity demanded truth regardless of how uncomfortable that truth might be. He authorized the dual laboratory approach despite knowing it signaled a lack of complete trust, a wound that added to the many others their relationship had accumulated over recent months. The 3-week waiting period between sample collection and results felt interminable. Palace staff who knew about the testing reported that the atmosphere inside royal residences grew increasingly tense as December approached. Camilla stopped sleeping properly, her face taking on a hollow, haunted quality that makeup couldn't conceal. Charles threw himself into official duties with an intensity that worried his private secretary, as though constant motion might somehow delay the arrival of information he both needed and dreaded. Security measures to prevent leaks were extraordinary. Fewer than 8 people in the entire royal household knew the complete details of what was being tested and why. Communications were conducted through encrypted channels. The laboratories were paid through untraceable accounts. And every person involved signed confidentiality agreements backed by legal consequences, severe enough to ensure silence. The monarchy had survived many scandals, but this secret, if it leaked before the palace controlled the narrative, could damage the institution's credibility in ways that would take generations to repair. The results arrive. December 3rd dawned cold and gray over the Wiltshire countryside where Ray Mill House sat nestled among bare winter trees. Camilla had been awake since 5 in the morning, unable to sleep as the anticipated arrival time approached. The courier from Zurich was scheduled to arrive at 7, and she had insisted on receiving the results alone, without Charles present, without staff hovering, without anyone who might witness whatever reaction the envelope's contents provoked. At precisely 7:13, a black sedan pulled through the gates. The trusted aide who had flown overnight from Switzerland emerged, carrying a leather portfolio that seemed far too ordinary for the weight of what it contained. He handed it to Camilla at the door with a brief nod, no words exchanged, and departed immediately. Some deliveries require no conversation, no pleasantries, just the transfer of information that will change everything. Camilla stood in her entrance hall holding the portfolio for nearly 5 minutes, unable to move forward or retreat. Her hands trembled slightly and her breathing had become shallow and rapid. Finally, she walked to her private study, closed the door, and sat at the desk where she had written countless letters, managed household affairs, and navigated the complicated logistics of being connected to the royal family for decades. She opened the portfolio with hands that shook visibly. The report was professionally formatted, dense with genetic terminology and statistical analysis, but the conclusions were presented with clinical clarity that required no scientific background to understand. The first section addressed Tom Parker Bowles. The genetic markers definitively excluded Andrew Parker Bowles as the biological father. The probability of paternity for the suspected biological father, a man Camilla had been involved with during the relevant period, exceeded 99.9%. There was no ambiguity, no room for alternative interpretation, just cold scientific fact. The second section addressed Laura Lopes. Again, Andrew Parker Bowles was excluded as biological father. The genetic analysis pointed to a different man than Tom's biological father, confirming that both children had been conceived outside her marriage to Andrew, during overlapping but distinct relationships that she had maintained with careful secrecy. The probability statistics were equally definitive, equally impossible to dispute or explain away. Camilla read the conclusions 3 times, each reading confirming what she had feared for the past 3 weeks. The truth she had buried for nearly 50 years, the secret she had protected through 2 marriages, countless public appearances, and her elevation to Queen Consort, was now documented in black and white with the authority of modern science behind it. There was no escaping it, no reframing it, no hoping it might somehow be wrong. Her first phone call to Charles was barely coherent. She wept through most of it, managing only fragments of sentences between sobs. "The results," she gasped. "It's confirmed. Everything they suspected, both children." Charles, receiving this news while reviewing papers in his Balmoral study, felt something inside him crack. Not anger exactly, though, that would come later. Something closer to profound grief for the woman he loved and the impossible situation they now faced together. "I'm coming now," he said, his voice stripped of all emotion except determination. Within minutes, He had canceled his entire day's schedule and ordered his helicopter prepared. The staff, accustomed to sudden changes but surprised by the urgency, asked no questions. The king's expression made clear that this was not a moment for curiosity or delay. Camilla's second call went to Tom, then Laura. Both conversations followed similar patterns: apologies that could never be adequate, explanations that sounded hollow even as she offered them, assurances that Andrew had always known and had chosen to raise them as his own, out of love and duty, and finally, the devastating admission that everything they had believed about their identity, their heritage, their place in the world, was built on a foundation of deliberate deception. Tom's response was quiet devastation. "Does Father know?" he asked, using the title he had always used for Andrew Parker Bowles. When Camilla confirmed that Andrew had always known, had been complicit in the arrangement from the beginning, Tom's voice took on a tone she had never heard from him before. Not anger, but something deeper and more permanent. "I need time," he said, and ended the call. Laura's reaction was sharper, more immediate in its fury. "How could you?" she demanded. "How could you let us live our entire lives not knowing who we actually are?" Camilla had no answer that could bridge the gap between her choices decades ago and their consequences today. The call ended with Laura saying she needed space, needed to process, needed to decide whether she could ever look at her mother the same way again. By 8 in the morning, Camilla sat alone in her study. The genetic report spread before her phone silent, and her entire world reduced to the clinical language of DNA analysis that had finally, irrevocably, exposed the truth she had spent half a century protecting. The palace response. News of the DNA results reached senior palace officials through carefully controlled briefings that began at 9:30 on the morning of December 3rd. The information was compartmentalized, with different members of the royal household receiving different levels of detail depending on their role and their need to know. Only the innermost circle, fewer than 6 people, received the complete picture. Everyone else got carefully edited versions designed to prepare them for crisis management without fully revealing the magnitude of what had been discovered. Prince William was briefed personally by his private secretary in a secure room at Kensington Palace. He listened in complete silence as the findings were explained, his expression remaining neutral, even as the implications settled over him. When the briefing concluded, his first question was characteristically practical. Who else knows? And what are the legal implications for succession and family structure? The answer provided some relief. Since Tom and Laura had never been in the line of succession and held no official royal roles, the constitutional impact was limited. But the damage to credibility, to the narrative the family had presented for decades, was potentially enormous. William's second question revealed the strategic mind that would one day lead the institution. What happens if this becomes public before we control the narrative? The communications team had already begun scenario planning, but the honest answer was uncomfortable. If the information leaked before the palace could frame it properly, the damage would be severe and long-lasting. The monarchy would face accusations of systematic deception, questions about what other family narratives might be fabricated, and intense pressure to release genetic information about other members of the family to prove legitimacy. Princess Anne received her briefing at 11 that morning. Her reaction was the controlled vindication of someone who had long suspected that Camilla's relationship with truth was more flexible than the institution could afford. "I warned that secrets of this magnitude surface eventually," she said quietly. "The question now is whether we compound the deception with continued silence or find a way to acknowledge what's happened without destroying what remains of public trust." Her preference was clear. Truth, however painful, however damaging in the short term, was always preferable to the slow poison of ongoing deception. Catherine, Princess of Wales, was briefed separately by William later that afternoon. Her response reflected the careful balance she had always maintained between family loyalty and institutional responsibility. She expressed sympathy for Camilla's obvious distress, while also acknowledging that the situation represented exactly the kind of blurred boundary between personal life and public role that the monarchy could no longer afford. Her concern focused primarily on how the revelation might affect the institution's relationship with younger generations, who already questioned whether the royal family deserved continued public support. The legal team spent the afternoon reviewing implications from every conceivable angle: marriage laws, inheritance questions, potential claims from the biological fathers or their families, and most critically, whether any criminal deception had occurred that might expose the family to legal action. The conclusion was cautiously optimistic, since no one had been materially harmed by the deception in ways that created legal liability, and since aristocratic families had historically handled such matters privately without state intervention, the legal exposure appeared minimal. But legal risk and reputational risk were entirely different calculations. Communication strategy discussions consumed the rest of the day. The palace needed to prepare for multiple scenarios. If the information remained contained, they could manage Camilla's position quietly through gradual distancing and reduced public presence. If it leaked, they needed prepared statements that acknowledged truth without appearing to celebrate or minimize decades of deception. The challenge was finding language that satisfied both those who would demand accountability and those who would see the revelation as unnecessary cruelty toward a woman already diminished. By evening, a consensus had emerged among senior advisors. The information must remain classified for now, but preparations for eventual public knowledge should begin immediately. That meant adjusting Camilla's future role to minimize visibility, ensuring that official family narratives no longer depended on claims about her children that might be challenged, and most critically, preventing any situation where the palace might be forced to actively defend a version of events now proven false by genetic evidence. King Charles, arriving back at Ray Mill House by mid-afternoon, was briefed on these preliminary decisions by secure phone. He listened without comment, understanding that the institution was already moving to protect itself regardless of his personal feelings. The machinery of monarchy, once engaged, operated with ruthless efficiency that prioritized survival over sentiment. His wife sat devastated in her study. His stepchildren were processing life-altering revelations about their identity, and the palace was already planning how to manage the fallout with or without his blessing. The truth. King Charles arrived at Ray Mill House at 3:47 in the afternoon on December 3rd, emerging from his helicopter with an expression that staff later described as carrying the weight of decades compressed into a single devastating day. The normally composed monarch moved through the entrance with uncharacteristic hesitation, as though each step toward the confrontation waiting inside required conscious effort. He found Camilla exactly where he expected her, still in her study, still surrounded by the papers that had shattered her world 8 hours earlier. She looked up when he entered, and he saw immediately that this was not the resilient woman who had weathered decades of public condemnation. This was someone fundamentally broken, her face blotchy from hours of crying, her eyes red and swollen, her entire body seeming smaller somehow. The genetic report lay spread across her desk like evidence at a crime scene, and in a sense, that's exactly what it was. Evidence of a deception so profound that even those who had suspected the truth for years felt shocked by the clinical confirmation. "I'm sorry," she whispered as Charles closed the door behind him. "I'm so sorry." The words came out choked, barely audible, and utterly inadequate for the magnitude of what had been revealed. Charles stood silent for a long moment, trying to reconcile the woman before him with the person he thought he had known for most of his adult life. How many conversations had they shared over the decades? How many intimate moments, shared secrets, plans for the future? And through all of it, this massive deception had existed beneath everything they had built together. "Did Andrew always know?" Charles finally asked, his voice carefully controlled. It was the question that had haunted him during the helicopter flight south, the detail that would determine whether Camilla had been complicit in active deception or merely guilty of maintaining a secret arrangement. The distinction mattered, though he couldn't fully articulate why. Camilla nodded, unable to meet his eyes. He knew from the beginning. We made an arrangement. It was common enough in those circles in that era, a marriage of convenience that protected everyone's reputation and gave the children legitimacy they wouldn't have had otherwise. Andrew loved them as his own. He never treated them differently. Her voice broke on the last words. He was kinder about it than I deserved. But you never told me, Charles said quietly. It wasn't an accusation exactly, more a statement of fact that carried its own weight. In all the years, all the conversations about honesty and truth, you never told me that your children weren't Andrew's. The pain in his voice was evident now, breaking through the controlled exterior. Did you think I wouldn't understand? Camilla's response came between sobs. I was ashamed. I thought if you knew the full truth, knew that both children came from different affairs, you would see me differently. As damaged, as unworthy of the role I eventually hoped to fill beside you. She looked up at him finally, her eyes desperate for understanding. By the time we were together seriously, the secret had existed for so long that admitting it felt impossible. It would have meant confessing decades of deception. Charles moved to the window, staring out at the winter landscape without really seeing it. His mind was racing through memories, recontextualizing decades of shared history through the lens of this new information. Every family gathering where Andrew had played the devoted father. Every public appearance where Camilla had presented Tom and Laura as Parker Bowles' children without qualification. All of it now revealed as performance built on carefully maintained fiction. The children, he said finally, turning back to face her. How are they? It was the question of a man trying to find solid ground in a situation where everything had shifted. Whatever anger or betrayal he felt toward Camilla, the children had done nothing wrong beyond being born into circumstances they never chose. Devastated, Camilla whispered. Tom was quiet, controlled, but I could hear it in his voice. Everything he thought he knew about himself just evaporated, and Laura was angry in a way I've never heard from her before. She asked how I could let them live their entire lives not knowing who they actually are. And I had no answer, Charles. No answer that could possibly justify what I've done to them. The confrontation that followed was not loud or dramatic. There were no raised voices, no theatrical displays of emotion. Instead, it was quiet and devastating. A conversation between two people who had loved each other for decades, discovering that love alone could not bridge certain kinds of deception. Charles asked questions, seeking to understand the full scope of what had been hidden. Camilla answered as honestly as she could, though decades of practiced discretion made complete honesty difficult even now. The most painful moment came when Charles asked about her fears going forward. What happens now? Camilla's response revealed the depth of her breakdown. I don't know if Tom and Laura will ever forgive me. I don't know if the palace can contain this, or if it will destroy what's left of my reputation. I don't know if you can still look at me the same way. She paused, gathering courage. I don't even know who I am anymore, Charles. My entire adult life has been built on this secret, and now that it's exposed, I feel like there's nothing solid left beneath me. Charles moved to her then, not with romantic comfort, but with the heavy duty of a man who understood that abandoning someone in their darkest moment would diminish him regardless of what they had done. He placed a hand on her shoulder, a gesture that carried both support and distance. We'll manage this, he said quietly, though the we felt fragile, uncertain. But I need time to process what this means. As evening darkness settled over Ray Mill House, King Charles and Queen Camilla sat in that study surrounded by genetic evidence of deception, two people discovering that the hardest truths are often the ones hiding in plain sight, protected by silence, and the shared conspiracy of those who benefit from never asking the questions that matter most. The wider implications on a stained monarchy. The revelation of the DNA results extended far beyond the personal devastation experienced by Camilla and her immediate family. The implications rippled outward, touching every aspect of the monarchy's credibility. The aristocratic circles that had long protected such secrets, and the public's willingness to accept the narratives presented by powerful families about their own histories. By the evening of December 3rd, As news of Camilla's breakdown filtered through the tightest circles of the palace household, senior advisors were already mapping out consequences that would take years to fully manifest. For Tom Parker Bowles and Laura Lopes, the immediate future looked profoundly uncertain. Both had built their adult identities on the foundation of being Parker Bowles children, connected to a respected military family with deep aristocratic roots. That identity had shaped their social circles, their professional opportunities, and their sense of place in the intricate hierarchy of British society. Now, confronted with genetic evidence that their biological fathers were different men entirely, they face the disorienting prospect of reconstructing their understanding of themselves at ages where such fundamental identity shifts are extraordinarily painful. Tom, as the older sibling and someone who had maintained closer ties to both the Parker Bowles family and the royal circle, faced additional complications. His career as a food writer and critic had been built partly on name recognition and social connections that stemmed from his assumed parentage. While his professional accomplishments were legitimate, the revelation threatened to cast everything he had achieved in a different light, inviting speculation about what opportunities might have been closed to him had his true parentage been known from the beginning. More painfully, he now had to decide whether to reach out to his biological father, a man he likely knew socially, but had never understood as his actual parent. Laura confronted similar questions, but with the added complexity of her own children. She had raised them with stories about their grandfather Andrew, about their heritage and family history. Now she faced the prospect of explaining to them that much of what they had been told about their lineage was fiction, that their actual genetic heritage came from someone else entirely. The conversations she would need to have with her children mirrored the devastating conversation her mother had just had with her, creating a cycle of revelation and loss that would echo through generations. Andrew Parker Bowles occupied perhaps the most complicated position in this unfolding drama. For nearly 50 years, he had maintained the fiction that Tom and Laura were his biological children, raising them with genuine affection while knowing the truth of their conception. His decision to participate in this deception had been shaped by aristocratic values that prioritized social stability and legitimate heirs over biological accuracy. In the circles he moved through, such arrangements were not unprecedented, even if they were never openly acknowledged. But now, with genetic testing making such secrets unsustainable, he faced questions about his own role in a deception that had harmed the children he genuinely loved. Sources close to Andrew suggested he was preparing a private statement, not for public release but for Tom and Laura, explaining his reasoning and his genuine feelings for them, regardless of biological connection. He had always known this day might come, especially as genetic testing became routine for medical purposes, and he had long ago made peace with whatever consequences might follow. His main concern now was ensuring that Tom and Laura understood his love for them had always been real, even if the biological foundation everyone assumed was not. For King Charles, the implications touched directly on his legacy and the judgment history would render on his reign. He had fought for decades to marry Camilla, had weathered enormous public criticism, had asked the nation to accept her as his queen consort, despite the role she had played in the breakdown of his first marriage. Now, with the revelation that she had maintained such a profound deception throughout their relationship, questions would inevitably arise about his judgment, his ability to truly know the people closest to him, and whether the monarchy's already fragile credibility could withstand another crisis rooted in hidden truths and protected lies. Prince William's position was strengthened by the revelation in ways that made him deeply uncomfortable. He had opposed expanding Camilla's role, had insisted on boundaries and accountability, and had been proven correct in his assessment that her relationship with truth was more complicated than his father wanted to acknowledge. But vindication in this context felt hollow, offering no satisfaction when the cost was his father's pain and the institution's credibility. William understood that managing this crisis would fall largely to him, as it had with previous family scandals, and he approached the responsibility with grim determination rather than any sense of triumph. The broader question facing the monarchy was how to handle genetic revelations in an era where DNA testing was becoming routine and family secrets were increasingly impossible to maintain. The aristocratic practice of quietly managing paternity questions through private arrangements had worked for centuries, but modern science had made such discretion unsustainable. If the truth about Camilla's children became public, it would open questions about other members of the royal family, invite demands for genetic testing to prove legitimacy, and fundamentally challenge the narratives that had sustained the institution through generations. By the end of December 3rd, as palace lights dimmed and staff retreated to their quarters, one truth had become inescapable. The revelation had not just exposed a single family's secret, but had opened a fault line running through the entire structure of how the monarchy and the aristocracy had historically managed uncomfortable truths about lineage, legitimacy, and the gap between public narrative and private reality. The breakdown of one woman in a country house had revealed cracks in a system that had always depended on secrets staying buried and questions remaining unasked.